you can see these slides, and this is the title, Psychedelic Drugs in Psychiatry, Back to the Future. So just to start with disclosures, I'm currently employed, as Costas said, by a company, Compass Pathways, that is seeking to really restore psychedelics to some sort of place in medicine. So I have that very obvious, I don't know, it's a conflict of interest, but it's a clear interest. And in addition, I've consulted with a number of companies in various kinds in the last year or three. What I'd like to do this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you are, is to give you a brief history of these medications, which are often called hallucinogens, but we need to be a little careful about terminology, I think, and we'll be a bit more specific in defining where they act, etc. I want to give a little history of the original medical era, because there was one, and it basically went wrong for interesting reasons. And we're now in a situation where we're trying to go back to reinvent an approach that we really lost for 2 generations. And it's not yet clear that we're going to be successful. So we have no reason to be complacent about the present situation, but it's a very interesting and fluid one. So the history of psychedelics, hallucinogens in the West really started with the discovery of LSD. And this is probably well known, was an accidental discovery. It was made by a Swiss scientist, Albert Hofmann, who worked as a chemist at Sandoz in Switzerland. And in 1938, he was involved in synthesizing a number of compounds derived from ergot. One of them was LSD. He was interested in applications really more to do with the peripheral nervous system, blood pressure, etc., than anything to do with the central nervous system. But for some reason which he himself can't explain, he had a hunch about this chemical entity, this LSD, that made him return to it in 1943, which was fully 5 years later. And he had a slight intuition that this was going to be an interesting drug, and he eventually administered what he thought was a low dose of the drug to himself to discover what it did. This was not at all unusual, really, until the present day, although I think probably much less now, that the inventors of chemicals, the inventors of drugs, would actually try them out on themselves as a sort of first step in the process of making them medically useful entities. So his first chosen dose, was 250 micrograms that he thought was a very small dose. And that dose had a very dramatic effect. And I'm not doing well this. He gave the count. What actually happened was that he took the drug and then decided to cycle home for lunch. And on that bicycle ride, he started to have an increasingly strange experience. And if you like, the most obvious thing that happened was that he had very striking changes in his visual perception. So that, as you see here, he began to enjoy unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind closed eyes. So kaleidoscopic, fantastic images, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles, colored fountains, constant flux. So this is just part of the experience. In addition, he began to feel extremely anxious and paranoid, very frightened. So we know from the beginning, and this, remember, was someone who was completely unprepared for this experience, and preparation turns out to be very crucial in how we're going to use these medicines in the future. He had this really extraordinary experience, which had a number of implications. The first was that this was a clear change in how people perceived and experienced the world, which was produced by a drug, and a very small dose of a drug. And at the time, remember, 1943, there was really no clear understanding that neurons communicated chemically, that the brain was essentially a chemical machine. And the leading authorities at the time, someone like Jack Eccles, who was the leading neurophysiologist, actually believed that synapses were electrical devices. And so it was only about 4 years later that the rest of the world caught up with what was really obvious from Hoffman's experience, which was the highest functions of the brain are mediated as a chemical machine. Now, what was the chemical? It's shown on the right, that was LSD, and on the left is shown the analogous structure that we now call serotonin, or 5-HT, 5-hydroxytryptamine. And 5-HT had barely been discovered in 1943. So it was initially established to be exist in the gut, where most serotonin actually still is. And only later was it really discovered and proven to be in the brain. So it turns out that what was happening was that LSD was activating receptors for serotonin in the brain. And we now know that these drugs are active at a particular receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor in the central nervous system. Now, there's not a completely exclusive effect, but it is widely believed on the basis of both animal experiments and also some human experiments that this is the key receptor for the effects that are most characteristic of these drugs listed on the left, that is LSD, DMT, 5-methoxy-DMT, psilocybin, and mescaline. Now, there are a large number of drugs of this type, and they occur naturally, with the exception of LSD, in a number of different preparations, some of which are associated with the practices of particularly indigenous peoples in across the world, but particularly famously in South America, and the use of particularly of ayahuasca, of toad venom, and of the other psychedelics, as we now call them, was discovered and, in a sense, publicized in the 1950s, but had been described before. So these drugs were not new to humanity, but they were certainly new to the West as synthetic elements. And of course, they were our understanding and the base of science has developed on the basis of what we have done. There are, in addition, drugs, dissociative drugs that are active at NMDA receptors. And I mention them because they have also, they probably are part of the mechanism of action of some of these traditionally used compounds. And so the dissociative drugs act apparently at NMDA receptors, and the particular compounds that we know from Western pharmacology are ketamine, phencyclidine, and indeed nitrous oxide, which seems to work at these receptors. Now, I'm assuming that most of you are psychiatrists, and you'll be aware that interest in these drugs in treating depression as rapid-acting medicines is also very current and is part of this, I think, very exciting new wave of treatments that we're having can become available in the last decade, particularly for depression, which I'll talk about. But let's just pursue the history of LSD. LSD was, as you've heard, made by Sandoz, and in those days, regulation was, to put it mildly, very light touch. So it was made available to particularly psychiatrists because it seemed obvious to the people who took it and observing the people who took it, that it had effects on the mind, that it might have potential for psychiatry. And so it was made available to interested psychiatrists, basically for experimentation on their patients. And as you can see here, this little booklet, this is the package insert, if you like, which was only 4 pages if you actually take a look at it, really describes in the following terms its use, which is for analytical psychotherapy to elicit release of repressed material and to provide mental relaxation, particularly in anxiety states and obsessional neuroses. So that was what the initial use of these medicines indicated it might be helpful for. The average initial dose was 25 micrograms, which is, as you may recall, a tenth of what the large dose that Hoffman took initially. And the recommendation was to use this repeatedly at psychotherapy sessions and in increasing doses until some ideal optimum was reached. And the statement here, as you can see, is that in individual cases, very large doses may be necessary. The recommendation is that this should be once a week. And in addition, it's noted that this can be done as a group therapy. The average number of treatments required varies from 7 to 10 or 14 to 15 in more severe cases. And there have been as many as 40 cases. So this is therefore the emphasis, and it's noted that proper psychiatric supervision is essential. So there we are. That's the start of the story with LSD. Its use as described there was characterized as being used as a psycholytic. So it was thought of as mind loosening. These relatively low doses were seen as an aid to talking therapy, and it was associated with particular individuals who both used it and promoted it as a useful way of helping patients. Now, bear in mind that this is at a time long before DSM diagnosis, when most psychiatry that didn't concern psychotic patients really dealt with the concept of neurosis. And the concept of neurosis was less of an activity of diagnosis than a way of providing an explanation about patient symptoms that was based very heavily on psychodynamic theory. Famously, Cary Grant had 60 sessions, and it was noted by Michael Pollan, who wrote quite graphically about this era in his book, How to Change Your Mind, that it was an excellent business model because people would keep coming back, perhaps for the drug, perhaps for the therapy. But anyway, they mainly paid for the therapy. Now, what is sort of lost in history, but has been looked at again by people who have gone back to the literature that developed at the time, is that the best outcomes were really described for anxiety, depression, and obsessive compulsive disorder. And the broad ballpark numbers that came out for good outcomes were around between 40 and 70%. Now, it's very difficult to map those reports onto what we now regard as adequate practice for RCTs. So there was very little sense that one needed to randomize patients to one treatment or another, very little sense that you necessarily need to use placebo, that you might compare different doses. There was just a rather poor quality literature. It's really been reviewed quite well recently by James Rucker, and it's certainly worth looking at that if you're interested. Now, the second way in which LSD was used was as a high dose and truly psychedelic. And the word psychedelic was coined by a man called Humphrey Osmond, who was a British psychiatrist who developed, working mainly in Canada, who developed an early interest in the effects of high doses of these drugs. And those doses produced much more profound and absorbing experiences that are not really amenable to interactions with a therapist. So they are essentially personal, inwardly directed, and can be very dramatic and are described as such, as a transcendent experience. And the objective, the very explicit objective of this, was to obtain a kind of spiritual epiphany. And the most famous person who kind of took this dose and wrote about it was Aldous Huxley. And Aldous Huxley was a remarkably good writer in English, and the book is well worth reading now because it's mercifully short, but he wrote a book called The Doors of Perception. And he became very interested in it and saw it very much as linking to his sense of spirituality. So I think one of the difficulties with this approach was that it was inherently demedicalizing. So it kind of took people out of if you like, what was then the psychiatric paradigm of psychoanalysis, and it moved you into something that was much closer to religious experience and breakthrough experiences, mystical experiences, which of course are very attractive at one level, but were not essentially they weren't the terrain really necessarily of psychiatrists, even though psychiatrists were interested and promoted this approach. The medical use was not enormous, but it resulted in quite a lot of publications. So this was by no means a secret, and there were about, it's estimated, 40,000 patients were treated in one way and another. Now, what also happened was that this became a kind of publicly known fact that these drugs had dramatic effects on perception, consciousness, and the understanding of the world. And that sort of became bound up, this recreational use started outside of medical control, which in a sense became as its object the transformation of society. And the person most associated with that was Timothy Leary, and he is often credited to have been the leader of the psychedelic movement, as it was often called. And he asked interesting questions like, is there a life after youth, as you can see on this slide, to which the answer is obviously yes, for those of us on this panel anyway. So Timothy Leary coined the phrase, tune in, turn on, drop out. And his activities were really gained an awful lot of public and media attention. And it was at a time in the United States where there was a massive polarization around the politics of the Vietnam War. And arguably, Bob can talk about this, but arguably some of the fissures that developed in American society at that point are still echoing through with us today. And the side that was against the war, predominantly young people, predominantly people at risk of the draft, but particularly well-educated college people, were the ones who took these drugs as a recreational thing, and a subgroup of them saw them as simply a different way of living, a different way of seeing the world, an alternative culture. And this really produced, because of its alignment with the politics of the time, produced a kind of moral panic in the US government, which soon after this sort of became obvious as a problem, developed the notion of the war on drugs. And the government response to this was really the abandonment of the project by serious scientists. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the evangelism of these people was unattractive to, if you like, a serious group of relatively conservative people who were the scientific community. So the evangelism was unattractive, and it was meant to be anti-science in many ways. The demedicalization of the activity, the dominance of this recreational model, really made it seem improbable that it could be used clinically. And there were undoubtedly bad outcomes for people using these drugs under unsupervised conditions. And so the upshot of that was that the use of LSD and the related drugs was made illegal in about 1970. But interest in research had already tailed off before that. And I think the last NIMH grant was several years before the drugs were actually finally put under this with the likes of peyote, ecstasy, lysergic acid diethylamide, which is LSD. And indeed, all of this class of drugs were placed into this schedule, which has no accepted medical use, with a lack of accepted safety and high abuse potential. Medications within this schedule may not be prescribed, dispensed, or administered for medical use. So that, if you like, was that for research by responsible clinicians. And the only people who could use these drugs effectively were breaking the law. and they were happy, therefore, to be underground in using them. And the underground era lasted really through to the present day, and it still exists in the United States, really particularly famously on the West Coast, but actually in most states in the US, there are people who call themselves underground guides for people who are seeking psychedelic experiences. There was also innovation, chemical innovation. In this guy, Alexander Shulgin, was a chemist for the Dow Chemical Corporation. He, in fact, invented the first biodegradable pesticide, and he was rewarded for that by basically complete independence. I mean, he was given a free role within the company to just do what he wanted. And he then, and also a substantial amount of money to live on. And so he set up and is credited with the discovery and synthesis of over 200 psychoactive compounds. And he innovated around the basic LSD type ring structure that you saw earlier. If you want to read about what he did, then this book, PCAL, he wrote with his wife, is about his life and how he got into and investigated these drugs, because he wasn't content with just synthesizing them. He took them, all of them, tried them, usually with small groups of friends, and he invented his own way of describing them. And if you want to see the way he lived and the rather chaotic state of his laboratory, then this film, Dirty Pictures, is available on Netflix and is quite entertaining. But he was a big character, Shulgin, and he has obviously created a lot of chemical entities which have the potential to be investigated if it turns out that this class of drug is useful for psychiatric treatments. Now, I think we need to go back. So the underground era continued really through to, as you can see, I've used as a rather arbitrary date, February 2014. But around that time, and up in the 2000s, there had been a recrudescence of interest in investigating these drugs, first and foremost in healthy volunteers, and then the idea arose that the original description for a use in psychiatry might also be looked at in a little more detail. And one person who had all along been calling for this was a guy called Rick Doblin. He is ran the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and this was a project, particularly the highest priority project, was sponsoring FDA drug development research into MDMA-assisted therapy. And Rick Doblin is shown on the left here, and this is his role as a CEO, and this is his role on the lower picture, perhaps the way you would like to be best remembered as a man interested in psychedelics before his time, sitting with Hoffman, who was, of course, the discoverer of LSD. So what MAPS over 30 years has aimed to do was to try and bring back the use of psychedelics into specifically psychotherapy. So this is a model which is essentially psycholytic, if you can remember the old terminology. And the idea is that psycholytic treatment, particularly MDMA, will allow patients to use this psychotherapy that is used anyway to treat, for example, PTSD, in a more effective way to achieve more profound outcomes, to perhaps attain them quicker. And their first target has been post-traumatic stress disorder. And they have gone as far as is possible through, because they got breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA, they are now well along a development pathway into so-called phase 3, which should allow them to take a dossier of clinical trial data to the FDA for approval for this particular indication. The data is based on this trial design. So this is MDA-assisted therapy for severe PTSD. This is a phase 3 study. Perhaps I'll just move that if you can see. And what you see in different colors are the different kinds of interaction. So there's a screening, there's then assessment, there's preparation, there's tapering of other medications, another preparation, more tapering, and then finally, as you can see, an experimental session that takes place after various kinds of enrollment and, after various kinds of measurement and ratings. And the patients have 3 of these experimental sessions, and between each there are integration sessions that allow patients to reflect on the time they've had under the experience of the medication and to integrate that into their thinking about their symptoms and their illness. As you can see, overall, the study lasted about 18 weeks. And the total number of sessions are 3 preparatory sessions, 3 experimental sessions, 9 integration sessions, and 4 endpoint assessments. So there's a lot of contact here. So there's great deal potential for what one might call a placebo effect. And the key thing is that the actual experimental sessions, patients are randomized either to receive drug or placebo. And the difficulty with this is that the amount of psychological treatment layered into this, the extent to which there's expectation bias, and also the problem that blinding is virtually impossible if one gives large doses of these kinds of drugs, makes it tricky sometimes to interpret findings. But nevertheless, findings are what we want in order to understand what have I done here? Yeah. So this shows you the results summarized on this slide for this phase 3 clinical trial. And the summary is shown on the left is the outcomes after 1, 2, or 3 sessions. Each column refers to those outcomes for placebo plus therapy. And on the right, the outcomes for MDMA-assisted therapy. And what you can probably see if you look particularly at the third column is that the number of patients who are described as losing a diagnosis or being responders runs at somewhere between 50 and 30% in the placebo group. Whereas by contrast, you can see that in the patients who were treated with MDMA, you have a much larger number of patients who lose the diagnosis, and up to 60% if you include people who are responders to the treatment. So this has been regarded as very promising. It's still quite a small study, even though it's described as phase 3. And I suppose the other thing that one has to say is that the outcome here is based on a scale called the CAPS. And it's also based on the effect, the impact on a single outcome, the most significant post-traumatic memory that the patients experience. And the difficulty with that is that it maybe risks isolating one element of the total clinical picture. And these patients often had quite complicated PTSD, and therefore were quite distressed. And therefore, we can't be completely sure that the overall quality of the response is as good in total as it may be for individual symptoms. So with that caveat, I think I'll leave this, but there are also other concerns about this trial which have surfaced recently and are no doubt going to have to be worked out because of the misbehavior by at least one of the therapists who appears to have been involved in the study. So this will work itself out in due course, but it's going to make things more complicated than it would otherwise be. And because this is essentially described as a psychotherapy, it's already going to be complicated for the FDA to consider this kind of data. Now, I've I've described that as psycholytic therapy because the doses are modest and patients remain in contact enough with reality to talk to have a dialogue with a therapist, and in fact, usually with two therapists. The new psychedelic therapy goes back to that model of a transcendent experience on a high dose of one of these drugs. And the people most associated with developing this on the left is Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University. And then on the right, Robin Carhart-Harris, David Nutt, and Amanda Fielding, who is a long-term campaigner for the availability of drugs for medical and other purposes. And they in the UK did studies at Imperial College, which have had a big impact in the field in recent years. The first of these studies, which had the impact I describe, was the use of psilocybin to treat depression and anxiety in cancer patients. And this was done by Roland Griffiths and colleagues at Johns Hopkins Medical School. They enrolled 51 patients with end-stage cancer. These patients were essentially had the existential distress, but along with that, a lot of anxiety and depressive symptoms. And these patients were put into a double-blind crossover trial design where they received either a low psilocybin dose, which was either 1 or 3 milligrams per 70 kilogram, to a high psilocybin dose, which was 22 or 30. These doses were changed during the course of the trial. But basically, this is a low or placebo dose, and this is a high and clearly a psychedelic dose. And what you can see is that if you look at over on the right here, in the group who, this is rating depression, the people who had the low dose first had something of a placebo response. So something like a 20% response, which is not uncommon for depression trials, of course. If those who had the high dose had something like a 90% clinical response. And those patients who actually showed remission were similarly running at very high levels for the high dose arm of the study, something like 60%. And these effects were extremely rapid, so that patients really responded virtually from the day on which the dose was delivered. And there was an effect also very prominently on anxiety. So again, if you define response, that's a 50% reduction in symptoms. You're looking at something like 80% versus 20%. And if you look at remission, and bear in mind that remission is a very high bar, you see patients who essentially return to normal mood in 50% of cases after the high dose. And the patients in the low dose subsequently responded when they received the high dose. So these effects were very striking. They were obviously in a specific patient group. There was this complication of the cancer, and there was also the complication of the crossover design, and the difficulties of blinding, which I've already described. And that's difficult both because the patients know, the doctors know, and if one's not careful, the raters who are looking at the patient's outcomes know. So it's a problem that's very hard to get over with this approach to treatment. Now, what was the mechanism? I'm just going to show you here that they used as a measure what they call a total mystical experience score. And you can probably see that in the two cases, so these are the when patients are responding either usually to the first or the second high dose, you can see there's an association between the total mystical experience score and the change both in the anxiety and the depression score, slightly higher in fact for the anxiety, but these are both statistically significant. And in addition, these total mystical experiences scores were very highly meaningful to the patient. So again, this connection with a quasi-religious experience is encouraged by the use of a scale that describes itself as mystical experience. In fact, what is very interesting about this, and the Imperial group who've gone in and studied this in more detail, they suggest that it's really the what is sometimes called the connectedness, the oceanic boundlessness that is produced as an experience by high-dose psychedelics that is both strongly associated with good outcomes in depression and anxiety. And that is very interesting, and it kind of relates to what Bob Cloninger was talking about in terms of restoring a sense of connectedness with the world, which of course can be related to meaning and can be religious, but it doesn't really have to be. It can be quite a secular experience as well. But it's a very important one to patients who become depressed and hopeless, particularly in the context of a fatal disease, which these patients had. Now, what I'd like to talk about further is just how we're going to remedicalize these conditions if we think it's worth it. The Hopkins group saw the existential distress of patients with cancer as a kind of obvious way to use drugs meaningfully. And they were very influenced by the idea that it was a sort of spiritual experience. The problem with that is that there isn't actually, in our modern diagnostic terminology, and certainly not for the FDA, there isn't such a thing as existential distress, which forms a target. It isn't kind of in DSM. And they hadn't really diagnosed patients as having major depression, etc., although they clearly had got the symptoms. And major depression isn't a very high bar anyway, as you'll be aware. But the route to remedicalization really requires that one has a conventional regulatory target. And so what is now happening is that there is an effort to try and, following, again, exploratory trials by academics, is to try and discover whether these medicines are useful for treatment-resistant depression, as you've heard, for post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also interest in substance use disorders and obsessive-compulsive disorders. And then finally, of course, treatment-resistant depression is just major depression that hasn't responded to other treatments. So there's some interest also in major depression. And there's a number of different groups who are taking different routes to try and produce the necessary data that will allow the FDA to approve these drugs for use in man on the basis of their efficacy and safety in a known condition. Now, the reason that I'm now Chief Medical Officer of a company is I'm interested in this project, and I joined this company, Compass Pathways, in the middle of last year to try and facilitate the move from a phase 2 study, which was just about to read out, to phase 3, which we hope may be able to start towards the end of this year. And the reason that treatment-resistant depression is important is that it's so common. It's estimated that certainly about a third of patients who present with major depression really fail to respond to first or second line treatment. And you'll recall the data from the STAR-D that suggested that as well. And that means that when you get to third line treatment, you've got a real problem because response rates are really quite low, and there's quite a lot of patients who are left in a demoralized and in many ways a worse state than the average person who has depression that's treatable. So this is the unmet need, and it means that there's both a medical and a commercial reason for trying to develop something that works in this patient group. The particular possibility of doing this and having it paid for by commercial investment is that there is a patent which is developed by the founder of this company for psilocybin as a synthetic high purity polymorphic crystal, which is called COMP360. Now this is psilocybin, but it has a particular because of the way it's prepared and because of its stability, it has a patent protection that is potentially allows this to be developed, and that gives a certain moat so that there is freedom to actually do the necessary work and have some patent protection over a number of years, so that the money that is spent on developing the medication can be recouped over the subsequent 6 to 11 years, depending on where you are. So we have the drug, and that is we think the primary ingredient, but we also know that we require psychological support. And we think that psychological support we should provide is essentially a safety measure. We don't really know how to facilitate the actions, the pharmacological actions of these drugs, but we do know that people need to be prepared for the experience they're going to have. So the psychological support means preparatory meetings with someone who can explain to patients exactly what's going to happen. It's the use of a digital platform that allows them to access more of that information when they want, so that they can, in a sense, complete a course, a psychoeducational course on the use of psychedelics. And that is combined with the day of treatment, before the day of treatment, and then the day of treatment. Again, you need a therapist to be with you the whole time to support you and to make sure things don't go wrong. This approach which I've described on here, was designated as having breakthrough status by the FDA, just as the PTSD application for MDMA was. And there was a phase 1 completion and then phase 2B clinical trial, which was recently completed. And this is the design of the trial for those of you who like clinical trials, which I certainly do. So these were patients with treatment-resistant depression. Over 90% of them were naive to psychedelics. So these were patients who came through conventional pathways. That hadn't been as true as some of the previous studies that had been done in academic centers. These patients met the criteria for treatment resistance because they had failed at least 2 and no more than 4 treatments of a conventional kind for their depressive episode. The depressive episode was no longer than 2 years, so we didn't want people with too chronic. We wanted a realistic kind of clinical population. And patients had to withdraw from most of the psychotropic medications that they might be taking, and in particular, the SSRIs. And that meant that we had to allow quite a long delay, potentially, both to prepare patients, but also to withdraw them from SSRIs. And that proved to be highly feasible. In fact, when patients are well motivated, the problems with withdrawal of SSRIs are rather minor. So after this preparatory phase, patients were randomized to receive either 1 milligram, 10 milligrams, or 25 milligrams of psilocybin. And that was administered on a single day. And the patients remained in the session for from 6 to 8 hours. They then went home and they came back the next day, basically to complete an assessment, formal assessment. And there was repetition at weeks 1, week 2, week 3, and week 12. So we tried to continue this out to 12 weeks, although of course we knew that at some point patients who had not responded or had been in the low dose group might want to go back onto treatment. There were also a couple of remote assessments at weeks 6 and 9 to stay in touch with the patient. Now, the primary endpoint was the reduction in symptoms using the MADRS rating scale at 3 weeks. And the MADRS in all cases was administered remotely by blinded raters who did not really know the nature of the study, let alone any of the details about the patient. And that's the main protection, we think, against bias in this sort of clinical trial. And what were the findings? Well, what this shows is that there is a dose-effect relationship. So in blue, you can see the 25 milligram dose and its effect on the MADRS scores. So the reduction, as you can see, of about 15 on the MADRS for the 25. And this is from, a baseline MADRS of around 30 to 33, which is basically most of the patients were severe according to MADRS definitions. But moderate to severe would be the group that are really being studied here. So you can see 25 milligrams, 10 milligrams, and 1 milligram curves. The red is the 10 milligram, the dark color here is the 1. And you can see that there is an immediate effect, which you can measure at day 2. Many patients in remission on day 2, just as I said before, it's an extraordinary effect. With some loss of effect as we observe patients up to 6 and then up to 12 weeks. But a more marked loss of effect in the other patient groups who are drifting up through over that time. There's a highly statistically significant difference of 6 points at 3 weeks. And of course, that's compares very favorably with the kind of differences that are described in trials with SSRIs, which are sometimes less than 3 points on the MADRS. This is, of course, all very well, but the question is how many of these patients don't actually show this drift and remain well? And that is interesting because there is a significant fraction of them. So the numbers of patients who were sustained responders out at week 12, so that is patients who'd not received any further treatment, they'd had a single dose of the psilocybin, about a quarter of the patients in the 25 milligram group remained in that state at 12 weeks. So a certain subset of patients, this experience has quite a kind of, if you like, it kind of throws a switch. It changes the way they see things, and they really do show a very sustained and durable response. But it leaves us with a lot of people who do not have that. And obviously that's going to be something that has to be investigated. Can we change, improve this number? Is this just a characteristic of the TRD population? How can we get these numbers better? But the patients who do respond have a very high quality response. And I want to illustrate that just by looking at their ratings of their own clinical condition. So I'm comparing here in blue the good responders that I've just shown you with non-responders. These are people who may have a psychedelic experience, but they have no clinical response. And what you can see is that the self-rating of depressive symptoms falls in the well-treated patients. So this is selected groups. They're illustrative. It's not a simple. It's not. You can't give statistics to this. This is just illustrative. But what you can see here is that the levels on the QIDS, which is a self-rating depression scale, fall to under 5, which is basically what healthy people score themselves as when you use the QIDS in them. And the quality of life scale goes up from 0.5 up to somewhere between 0.9 and 1, which again is where a healthy population scores itself. And then finally, we see a sustained increase, at least for the first 3 weeks, in positive affect, which again is something we think may be a particularly useful property of this approach to treatment. So the quality of the response in these people who do respond is very, very good. And it's well sustained. Now, the flip side of all of this is how tolerable are the adverse effects? How much are they? Are they a high price to pay for the treatment outcomes? And basically, this just shows you the summary that obviously for some of them, like nausea and fatigue, are related to the dose of the drug and are all recorded immediately after the treatment. So they're recorded on the day following the day of administration of the drug. And patients are asked what they complain of in that time, any adverse effects. And these are the kinds of things they describe. So most of the effects that are described are not severe, and they occur immediately on the day of, and they're sort of to be expected. And what we need to work out is which of them are really wanted, which are a part of the treatment, and which of them are unwanted and are anti-treatment, as it were. And we still have to work on that. So effectively, what is very reassuring is that this is a well-tolerated acute experience for patients with treatment-resistant depression. And we couldn't have known that before these studies were done. So that's very reassuring. However, as always in depression trials, suicidality is a big issue. And suicidality wasn't a feature of the first day, but we did have people who became suicidal over the course of the follow-up. And you can see the rates at which that occurred was something between 5 and 7%. And those rates are what you probably would expect by comparison with other trials which have included treatment-resistant depression patients. So you have to accept that this is an issue for this approach to treatment, that we're going to have to, as with all treatments for depression, be vigilant about the clinical course. But on average, there were no differences between the 3 arms. There were some serious adverse events which occurred in the 25 milligram arm, and we can't explain why they clustered in that arm. There were only 3 important ones. And we obviously keep an eye on serious adverse events, which are classified rather strictly in relation to suicidality in a way that slightly amplifies the true risks of the usual events that are being captured. But that's a technical matter, but it doesn't diminish the fact that we'll have to keep an eye on suicidality as an issue for patients treated with this modality in the future. These patients were all withdrawn from SSRIs. Could it be that psilocybin could be adjunctive? Well, this is a study that's actually done in healthy volunteers, and it shows that if you put healthy volunteers on escitalopram or placebo and then give them a high dose of psilocybin, then in fact the co-treatment with the antidepressant SSRI doesn't actually affect the magnitude of the psychedelic experience. So this is our preferred measure, which is called the Altered States of Consciousness Scale, which has 5 dimensions. And what you can see here is that basically the placebo and the escitalopram numbers cluster very closely for all of these different measures, which are described along here. And the only one that separates a bit is in fact an anxiety dimension, and it's actually rather less in patients treated with escitalopram. So this opens the possibility that we can use psilocybin as an adjunctive treatment with SSRIs, as well as in patients who have withdrawn from SSRIs. That wasn't known before. We have very preliminary data that supports this interpretation, and we shall see whether that turns out to offer a better choice to patients in the future. So that's where we are. I've given you a history of these drugs. I've told you a little bit about the original medical era, how it all went wrong, really, and how it, I think, could go wrong again, and how it's now going much better. And I think we're at a stage now where we may be able to embark on a phase 3 program, which over several years may allow us to bring this approach to treatment to patients in clinics across the world, hopefully. There is a political dimension to this, and I think it's worth understanding that where we are, the use of the compound is I've tried to show on the top here. So there is simple illegal use, whatever that's usually, essentially, the way we're positioned we're in at the moment in most countries. There is really no regulation. There's simply none or law enforcement. And the leadership, the provision, is really by people who are prepared to break the law, which I think is a problem. There is a ritual or traditional use, and obviously we're the WPA, we've got to take account of the whole world, and there are many societies in which there is a ritual and traditional use of drugs of this kind. They're usually related to various forms of belief system, and the people who run them have the status of priests, although in some cultures they're called shamans or whatever. But obviously this is one of the ways in which these drugs are used, which we have to respect and is open for people to develop. But in the West, it doesn't seem very likely that's a route we would logically take. We don't have a structure to pin that onto. I think it's much more sensible to think of our culture as being better adapted to a medical approach. And I think in most cultures, actually, a medical approach is probably going to be the safest. If you take a medical approach, then you have to use the conventional models for deciding whether drugs are efficacious and safe. And that means very expensive development programs. And the only way to do that, I think, is to have private investment that allows people to make a profit eventually from the development of the treatments. But the key thing about a regulatory model is that the cost to patients who can't afford it can be reimbursed. And I think it should be psychiatrists who develop this approach. Finally, if we say that these drugs should be freely available, they should be decriminalized, made freely, make it no penalty to possess them, then essentially they become recreational, and the leaders basically going to be Hollywood. And I don't think that's, I think that in that direction is potentially a disaster for various reasons. So I think that the route to fair and safe access is regulation, not recreation. and that remedicalization is the best route to legalization. And that's the reason I'm Chief Medical Officer of a private company. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be very happy to take questions.